So I'm one of the organizers, but also one of the presenters too. And this research has been done with my collaborators, Rick, and my student, actually Priya. She's my PhD student at Penn State University. And the title of the talk is Vulnerability-Based Security Pattern Categorization in Search of Missing Patterns. And we're trying to investigate somehow these security patterns out there and try to provide some sort of an order in all these many security patterns out there, somehow create a way to categorize them more systematically using the right kind of criteria. So, why do software developers fail to build software security into the software they're building? I think the biggest issue there is really, a lot of times, software developers are not security experts. I mean, they can build the software, but at the same time, when it comes to the security knowledge, I mean, a lot of times they don't really have much. So there has to be a way to help these software developers so that somehow they get some guidance in the process. So security patterns are one of the ways of doing it. So that's why we're interested in security patterns a lot. So for those of you who are not very familiar with security patterns, anybody, I mean, never heard of security patterns in the audience a little bit? Yeah, okay. So just to give you a brief definition, it's a security pattern is a credentialed solution to recurring information security problems, meaning this type of pattern has been developed as part of this community process and as sort of a consensus among the people in the community. So it's not like somebody can simply invent this security pattern, and over the years people have discovered these patterns actually working when it comes to solving these recurring security problems that are occurring over and over again. So typically they use sort of a template to define a security pattern, such as what are the problems, what are the solutions, what is the context, for example, these security patterns are being used. So per security pattern, we always have this sort of a template we use to describe the security patterns. And then another nice thing about this template is we also talk about potential side effects. So meaning, I mean, using a pattern is a good thing, but sometimes it does have a side effect and it may be affecting the other types of quality attributes of your software. So trade-offs are something you really have to consider all the time when you're using security patterns. And security here is really a keyword, and whenever we deal with something like security, whatever patterns we're dealing with here, these are architectural in nature, because something like security can be only dealt in an architectural context rather than, I would say, functional or local context. Because security is a weakest link phenomenon, meaning anything that goes wrong in your software can really break the security of your software. So you really have to be sure about the overall security of your software. Otherwise, right, I mean, if you have just a tiny vulnerability somewhere in your software is still not very secure, right? So that's why it is architectural in nature. And when I say architectural, what that means is really global type of thing rather than a local thing. Any questions? No. Good. So what's the significance of security patterns, or for that matter, any types of patterns out there, I mean, the first thing I can think of is whenever you're developing your software, you always have requirements, and sometimes you don't really have any ideas of how to really satisfy those requirements. But when you have a pattern, you already have a ready-made solution. I mean, that may or may not work for your situation, but still you have at least something to begin with, so that's a good thing. And it also provides sort of a vocabulary in your team when you try to reason about the security of your software, or when you try to communicate, right, about all these different types of security aspects in your software. So I mean, in that sense, it's already a good thing. You're using the same language in your team. And I think the most important thing is it really bridges the gap between software designers and security experts. Meaning, in the beginning I told you, right, these software developers are not security experts. So for them to come up with or develop any type of security solution is very tough. However, by having this security pattern, you can simply be taking advantage of the existing solution. So that's why I'm saying it bridges the gap between software designers and security experts, because the experts have already built these patterns for you, and in your case, as a consumer, you're just using the pattern. Of course, to be able to use the pattern properly, you have to have pretty good knowledge of what the pattern does. So you have, as a result, access to this distilled wisdom of best security minds out there. So I'm going to be sidetracking a little bit, but one of the papers we recently published is about the importance of these frameworks. So instead of trying to develop your own security code, why not use, for example, the existing security frameworks? I mean, it does have its own problems. So that is pretty much similar to this idea. I mean, using the patterns versus, starting from scratch. So in 2004, Fernandez et al., they proposed in their paper somehow using these security patterns to deal with these threats. And it's not just them, but also other people somehow promoting this idea of using security patterns to deal with the threats. And it makes sense on the surface, because you have a bunch of threats always threatening you. And what they said was, security pattern is a design response to a perceived security threat, and to stop or mitigate the threat, you use the security pattern, and security pattern is really not intended to repair a vulnerability. But I dare to kind of disagree with this idea, because in this paper the main idea is really vulnerability is a root cause of all the problem. When these attackers, they somehow attack the software, they try to take advantage of these existing vulnerabilities. So in the end, what's really being exploited is the vulnerability. So that's where everything is originating from. So that's why we're thinking that somehow we have to deal with the vulnerabilities rather than the threats, because vulnerabilities are more fundamental than the threats. So that's one of the reasons why you're trying to categorize these security patterns according to the vulnerabilities rather than based on the threats. So that's really the main motivation. So as long as the vulnerabilities exist, the same threat is still there. Maybe that particular threat is gone now, but there could be so many other types of threats out there that could be using or taking advantage of the same vulnerability. So unless you take care of the vulnerability, the software is still vulnerable. So that's really the main idea. Any questions? Okay. So, like I said, in this paper, what we do is we relate these vulnerabilities out there. So as a way to categorize the patterns, relate the vulnerabilities to the patterns, and then as a result, at the end of the process, we end up finding what sort of software vulnerabilities are not being covered by these security patterns, which is an important discovery because that means there is a gap in the existing solutions out there, and then somehow, based on that, we may be able to develop more security patterns, or we can talk to the community so that they could develop more security patterns to deal with the vulnerabilities.